welcome everybody to our afternoon panel and wrap up. And I just want to say that Professor Gonzalez set us up really well for this panel when she said that she thought one of the greatest threats to research culture was artificial intelligence and not COVID, because that's what we're really going to be focusing on here. With a couple of cases related to ChatGPT. And I know that our panel, it comes from very diverse perspectives, and we want to hear all of those on every case. And so we're going to show you the cases. I'll point out some highlights of the case, and then I'm going to throw out some specific questions related to each case. So don't feel you have to address the whole case at once. We're going to go question by question. And I actually, as Matt alluded to, I actually do research on identifying problematic research or misconduct in randomized controlled trials. So I might interject a little bit myself. That's a chair's prerogative, but not too much. So let's get going. And if we can show the first case, David. The next slide. No, go back one. Great. So I hope everybody can see this case about a researcher who has been suggested by a colleague to use ChatGPT to write her paper, because the colleague thinks that might help with the grammar and the phrasing. And I guess reflecting on our talk this morning, I'm thinking, let's just look at this case and say, well, does anything about this bother you? Are there any issues with this request made to the student or the junior researcher? So Kimberly, maybe I'll start with you. What bothers you? You don't have to solve it all now. Just say what bothers you about it, if anything.
Yeah, sure. So I don't know that it bothers me. I would say it shouldn't maybe be the first line or the default. I think, I use ChatGPT in my courses, and I have students look at their research area and then critique to see how accurate ChatGPT is. So I think depending on the way, if there's a draft and then the researcher puts it into ChatGPT to sort of look at what refinements were made, that's a potential. I would offer that they should be reaching out to colleagues instead. That's probably the better approach. Okay,
Sonia, anything bother you about it, or?
So if the ChatGPT is being used to correct grammar and spelling, which you can actually do when you use some of these word softwares, that's okay. I think the problem is that when ChatGPT actually writes the actual paper, right, the conclusions using the data, etc., and it doesn't allow the trainee to actually develop the skills that are needed to communicate the science. And again, it's a skill that is learned. I mean, English is not my first language, so I've had to learn how to communicate effectively in English, in the written form as well as oral. So again, I mean, if it's just to check grammar, it doesn't bother me as much as if okay, here, write a paper for me, which again, ChatGPT could do.
Yeah, we're gonna get into that a bit more, I think.
Yeah, so it doesn't bother me. I think I have just a meta comment. I have yet to attend a talk where we don't talk about ChatGPT since a year ago almost. So I'm very glad to see this here. I want to be a little bit more entertaining. I feel like we should embrace ChatGPT in general, and also I agree with Sonia that at the beginning it's good to learn the skills, but even if you're not learning the skills, I mean, ChatGPT and all these generative AI tools can help with so much, with just thinking about problems, writing, and so much stuff. So I feel like I have no problem about this if they're checking the results because they hallucinate and they make up stuff, and if they and they also learn. They can use the tool to actually learn how to write, and I feel that that's good.
Okay, so what's interesting here is you all put very narrow parameters on how ChatGPT would be used, and they fit in with the case on the grammar and the writing. And when I looked at that, I actually did have some concerns. I immediately thought of some of the values we discussed earlier today on accountability, who's actually writing that paper. And also transparency, maybe that would be a concern, or openness, like how do we know who is writing that? So those were just a couple issues. I just wonder, maybe a show of hands, did anybody have any issues with this in the audience, or put it in the chat if you have? Everybody's so positive. Maybe it's because we've been talking about it for a year. Everybody is very positive about this. Oh, now I see lots of hands.
No,
Anybody want to shout out any?
I have a question.
Yeah.
I mean, if someone uses ChatGPT to write this paper, is there a disclaimer up front that this was done with the help of ChatGPT?
We are going to get to that in 1 second. Let's just take a moment to see if there were any new issues raised. Yes? Or concerns, sorry.
Well, I guess I was just thinking from a resource standpoint, having editing support available in kind of a justice kind of way. I guess I'm going back to whoever's great slide that was. At least that's what I'm thinking about. Like that editing support could also help that student. Not that ChatGPT doesn't have a place, but anyway.
Any other new issue anyone would like to, yes?
Just like my first reaction was like, that's terrible. You can't do that. That's evil, right? Learning to write and talk like a scientist is part of the training. Like, what if one day you don't have ChatGPT to help you? What are you going to do? But then I listened to your answers and I completely changed my mind. So that's really good, right? That's why we come to these things. And I'm wondering now is like, in the future, could we see as part of just picking on graduate students, as part of graduate student training, a course on how to use generative AI ethically to help you become a better writer, a better communicator?
Okay, so we're not sure that your mic picked up. So I just want to say the suggestion, which was excellent, was on whether students should have a course on how to use regenerative AI in this constructive way. Any other throw out? Anything pop up on the chat, Ahmed? That's okay, so let's move on to what Sonia was wishing to talk about, because a question I would have is, say the student might think twice about this. Who should they talk to find out if there are any policies on this, how this is normally used, whether this is acceptable? I mean, probably her advisor, but what other resources could she go to get some advice about whether she should do this? Any thoughts on the panel?
I think it's maybe early days, and she might get a different answer based on who she goes to talk to. So I think gathering some advice from folks that she trusts. Again, we've talked about mentoring networks. Another great way to establish a mentoring network is to start asking these types of questions. Yeah, I mean, the Research Integrity Office is a place to start. Hopefully the PI, if they can have that conversation.
I actually was surprised several years ago to learn that the downtown campus actually uses a lot of professional grant writers to write grants. And again, there may be a very fine line between using these professional grant writers, which is apparently not a bad thing, versus using ChatGPT. And actually, I helped a scholar with their grant, and after I was done with the science and everything, he said, "Oh, I'm going to submit it now for cleanup by some resources on their campus." So, these resources are available that don't necessarily rely on ChatGPT, but again, I mean, someone else doing the work of communicating.
Can I say something?
This was just an immediate response, sorry, to Sonia, because some of you may remember that this used to be an issue around science writers. So people would submit articles, peer-reviewed journal articles, and it had actually been written by a science writer, not the author of the article. So same issues would arise, who's accountable, is this plagiarism, that kind of thing, but it was a person doing it instead of AI.
But that actually raises issues of equity, right? Because not everybody has access to those resources, and ChatGPT would be more accessible to people who don't have access. Oh, sorry. I'm a Latina, I forget things. So, I mean, that's, yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say those lines. I was gonna say something along those lines that when I was a grad student, my first language not English, and I would use these resources in the university to help me write grants or fellowships and even articles. And I feel a good heuristic is just to use the same principle to say, like ChatGPT to me helps with equity as well, in the sense that if someone who doesn't have access to those resources is able to use ChatGPT, they can think of ChatGPT as a human helper. That is not amazing. I mean, it's not like it still writes the same things, and I feel like very, very not the greatest writing ever, but it's a tool and it's very useful. And I feel like it can help in that sense. So if you can think of that as someone who is helping you, that you contracted that work, I think that's a good way of thinking about that. And so,
just a comment about using a resource like that to maybe write a paper for you or write a grant. Matt presented some of this to the CCTSI executive committee a couple of weeks ago. And the platform retains everything that you upload to it. So if you're uploading data to this platform to help write your manuscript, then is your data now in the public domain? Do you have issues of commercialization down the road if you had a technology that had promise for a patent or something like that?
And this is why I don't think we fully answered the question about resources that should be consulted by this person, right? Because if you don't know like how this works, you wouldn't know that you were giving up your intellectual property, really, or you wouldn't know that you were, putting it out there. So it'd be very important to get more information to find that out. Now, another potential resource is the journal itself, right? I mean, she must have an idea of what journal she wants to submit to. So does anybody think that journals might have policies on this, or? Yeah, want to say anything about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think journals are establishing policies around the way that ChatGPT is either referenced or used. But right, journals also have editing services. So you can, if that comes back, we recommend this goes to a translation service that can happen at the level of the journal as well. So.
Yeah, and
some journals, I think they can ask you to put ChatGPT as a co-author, for example. And I think funding agencies, on the other hand, don't allow, when you're reviewing for them, don't allow you to use ChatGPT. So that's an interesting decision.
Yeah, thank you for making that point, because it varies by journal in my experience. So I'm a senior research editor for a journal, Cochrane, the Cochrane Library, and we had a huge discussion over what our policy would be. So we do have a published policy. It says that if you use any artificial intelligence to write any part of the review, that had to be acknowledged, but you also had to say exactly what part that was. And it had to be so detailed. It made it actually very onerous acknowledgement because you had to detail it so much. But I do know in the course of developing that, I mean, other journals have just said, no, it's not allowed at all because of the issue around accountability. You can't make AI an author because it can't be accountable for the research, and one criteria for being an author is that you are accountable for the paper. So, so it's very, very variable. So, very important to know that there's not a simple answer to this. We need to dig into it to be able to advise this person in a competent way.
And I also just add,
yeah.
right? I mean, journals are also using AI themselves, right? In lots of ways to find reviewers, to do pre-review, to do authenticate, like all of these sorts of things. So I think it's a very interesting interface.
I have heard of journals using AI to do peer reviews. I actually have not seen an example of that, but I've heard of that. You've heard of that?
Not the peer review itself, but the sort of pre-review, like does it fit in the journal? What's the content? That sort of thing, to see if it's, kind of a fit for the journal, and maybe even to find reviewers.
I wonder if a paper was written by AI, it might get through the AI review better, So that's find out if the journal uses AI for review. That's another thing to find out. But let's also explore the equity issue that I think was raised by this case. And so if you remember, a postdoc is recommending to a woman in the research group who has English not as their first language to use this to help with the grammar and phrasing. Now, we have raised some potential risk of using AI as well as potential benefits. But do you think this is a suggestion that maybe would have, been given to everybody in the lab, or should have been given to everybody in the lab?
I think it's an interesting question, but I think generationally, right, folks, the younger generation is kind of used to it. They're using it all the time. So I think it might be second nature. I think, again, if we're coming back to culture and we're talking about establishing culture, addressing ChatGPT and all these things head on as a PI, not just instructors and all these other, just being wide open about it. It exists. We know you're using it. Here's how you use it. Here's how you don't. Here's how my group will and will not use it. And again, coming back to culture is really this other piece of there should be I expect you to peer review each other's manuscripts. This is what we do as a team, and this is how we move our work forward. So again, it could be a tool. I'm not surprised if it's even a first suggestion by someone of this generation, but.
I wanted to add, as a matter of fact, that hopefully when our grant gets funded, we are going to be training the scholars in a lot of these topics. So hopefully you'll be able to lecture to them. So, I think it's important to establish the expectations, as soon as a new person joins the lab, right? And that would include, okay, let's talk about, who writes the paper, who gets to review it, and everybody, again, has to buy into the collective good of the team. And, if ChatGPT is going to help, it's important to use it, but be very transparent about its use.
Yeah, I will add that I like the analogy of calculators, because so I kind of going back to some of the points that Sonia made before. I think it's useful for scientists to learn to do these things, to learn to write, to explain an idea. But if they know more or less how to do that, I'm perfectly fine with allowing them to use these things, because these things are going to stay with us. They're amazing. There is no denying. And I'm sure there are going to be new versions where you don't have to upload things into the cloud. They're going to run on your cell phone, on your computer, on Word. And so we should be open about it and make it happen, but have these expectations about learning first.
I was just going to ask, the worry I have, I don't know if any of you share it. The worry I have is that it sounds a lot like the way the case reads is it's like shirking mentorship responsibilities. And I worry that the English, not having English as a first language, it's easier to just, we'll go do it on ChatGPT in place of the mentorship that we've heard referenced in most of the presentations today. I don't know if is that a worry or no?
And it's a lot easier to just fan it out to someone else and not, it's like the mentor who says, oh, this is perfect, right? And you don't see a single red line anywhere. Those are ineffective mentors. So yes, especially because, again, there are certain skills that you have to learn if you want to be an effective, rigorous scientist. And one of them is to communicate the science. Yes, you may have issues with the grammar and spelling, but again, outfits like ChatGPT and others can actually help with that. Even Word.
Sorry, I'll just give a little anecdote. So I taught online for several years, a nutrition course, and most of the students were in New York. And there was a student who I had multiple semesters in a row, and I was constantly kind of hammering on this language grammar business. And but I realized, that they were learning the material, they were progressing, they were understanding the material. They lived in Brooklyn, and this is who they were going to be interfacing with. This is how they were going to be talking to their, right, as a nutritionist. And so this way of sort of, right, they need to communicate it. It's not all in perfect English grammar, the way that we want it, that it's traditionally passed through a scientific paper, right? So again, are they learning the concepts, and can they translate those? So this is in the context of a paper, I understand, right? But I think we have to think about that is this person knew the material, they were then going to be able to translate it to the population that they would be working with in a language that they would understand and in a dialect that they would understand. So I think there's some nuance.
Matt, I just wanted to follow up on your shirking mentorship point, because Kimberly, when you were talking today about open science, I'm a huge fan of open science. I think I published my first protocol in 1994, but nevertheless, as a very senior faculty member, every time, there's a new data management requirement, there's a new data sharing requirement, and what you get is a PPT, a PowerPoint presentation, read it over and go off and do it. And, it is a resource issue. And so I do worry when, students and postdocs are told, there's all these new requirements. Your mentor has never had to do this because they haven't, grown up in that culture. And then, just read the presentation or go to this website and that's it. So I do think we have to be cognizant of these tools. Can't replace that mentorship. I think that's important. Yes.
I just, in listening to this, I'd like to provide some food for thought for maybe the opposite side of the coin here, because you had mentioned earlier, Dr. Bero, that is this an example of equality, or is this, equally being distributed among the lab? And I'm posing here maybe that this could actually be an example of justice, where this person is being provided with the resources that match their needs as a non-English speaking or a non-first language English speaking person. And so I agree that may not be the first resource, right? But then it also goes to the point of, well, yes, English language editing services are available by journals, but you oftentimes have to pay for those. What if there's no extra funding for that? So then it comes back to this issue of justice. And I think too, just to speak to your idea of the mentor, is the mentor shirking their responsibilities? I would argue, is the mentor's time better spent like copy editing essentially, or providing that higher level input to the methods, the results, and the interpretation of the paper?
Great points. Great points. And I do think, the resources to do some of this, it really needs to come also from a higher level. So when clinical trial registration became mandatory, we saw that clinical trials, from lower or middle income countries just weren't being registered, and they were actually very valid clinical trials, but it actually took resources to get through all the systems to register the trials. And because they weren't registered, that had fall off, that they weren't included in guidelines, they weren't included in systematic reviews, they couldn't get published. So it had serious consequences. So I think all your points are just, spot on, and that the figuring out ways to improve this science in the most resource efficient way is really, really important, not just for us, but for really globally. So I think maybe we'll wrap up this case. I had a question about overall what might be the risk or the benefits, and boy, what I'm sure hearing is everybody really generally sees more benefit than risk. I guess if anybody has a different view, we could hear it, but it's been a very rich discussion. Anything on the chat?
So in the chat, there's just a discussion point, and They say medical doctors have to meet standards to keep licensure every couple of years. Maybe researchers should have to do the same. What are people's thoughts about that?
Sorry, meet what standards?
Yeah, they don't specify what standards, but are there standards that maybe researchers should have to meet every couple of years, similar to medical providers?
We actually do. We have to do the RCR training. We have to do, I don't know, even city training because we all work at a medical school. So, you know, there are a lot of mandates, especially from federal funding agencies, that anybody who does any research sponsored by these agencies has to do a variety of different trainings. And I think the latest one that I saw here has to do with security of the information, right? IT security, that, you know, we no longer have to rely exclusively on the IT department. Now we have to be stewards of whatever we put out there in the cloud. So yes, I mean, it's not as extensive, for example, as when you're dealing with human subjects, right? I mean, as basic scientists, we don't necessarily do the enrollment, et cetera, but we have to understand all the guidelines, privacy and, you know, the HIPAA rules, et cetera.
You have another point here?
I was just going to say that I do still have a concern with ChatGPT in this situation, even though I can see the benefits of it. And that I think it goes back to drawing the line between, is it purely copy editing and proofing, or is it translating into changing the meaning and the message? And that's where I would have issue with, is if it's in that space.
Well, that's a great segue, I think, to our next case, which is going to raise a number of other issues to consider. So, David, can we show case 2? So this one is actually, so this same junior researcher has finished her review and submitted it to the journal. And she actually is exploring using artificial intelligence more, and by interrogating information about the papers included in her review, she discovers that one, let's say, has an expression of concern published about it. So she's included it in her review, and it's got published expressions of concern about it. So would this raise questions for you, or what kinds of questions might this raise for you? So I'll start out here on the panel to see if this raises any questions for you, either about the review or the paper she's already submitted.
Well, I mean, I don't know whether, of course, I mean, ChatGPT will rely on whatever data is input, right? So if the data were faulty to begin with, obviously what the output will be faulty as well. So how do we know, for example, that the issue was ChatGPT and not the issue that the data that was input into the coding was faulty? So, you wouldn't know this, right? She wouldn't know why was the paper retracted.
So you don't really know how ChatGPT figured that out.
Right.
I guess I wanted to see if I can. So you mean ChatGPT wrote? I didn't understand that.
No,
the case.
Yeah.
So
sorry. So she is using ChatGPT to actually look at some of the papers she's included in her review, and so maybe she's saying, has this paper been cited since? So I've included this paper by Jones, and has it been cited since? You can easily go to this program and figure out like how a paper's been used. And so say in the process of interrogating how the papers she already included in her review has been used, she found out one was retracted or had, an expression of concern.
But the writing wasn't by ChatGPT. She's just using ChatGPT to kind of check.
Right.
That's
This
great.
is so
But
all we know is that a paper she's included in her review has been retracted or has an expression of concern. So I think Sonia raised the point, well, how did ChatGPT figured this out, like has it really been retracted? Is there expression of concern? But then this also might raise questions about the paper itself, right?
But I think this is a good thing, right? I mean, if ChatGPT found out that this paper had been retracted, regardless of the reason, that's a good thing, because then when she's writing her review, she's not citing this paper. So I think this is a positive outcome. I'm sorry.
And this is very implausible too, because ChatGPT sucks at these kinds of things. So I just wanted to throw that out there. We are humanizing ChatGPT so much but ChatGPT is really dumb. I just wanted to throw that information out there.
Yeah, I was going to say the same. I think, but bigger here in this is wherever if it was lack of mentoring or lack of pickup or whatever, right? Rule number one in writing paper is that you've read everything that you've cited. So this is not a ChatGPT problem. This is you do not cite a paper if you have not read it. Yeah. So where that breakdown occurred, we could hypothesize a long way, but that's the problem.
She should take advantage.
Great. All right. But lots coming at us here. So if you read a paper, you got this paper online, I'll get to your code, and you read it, like, do you actually know it's been retracted? Sometimes no. Let me tell you, you do not. So when you search electronic databases, there might be a tag that it's been retracted, or you might find it in Retraction Watch. It may have an expression of concern published in something like PubPeer that you will never find because that's not very searchable. But if you get a paper out of context, so you've worked with an information specialists would probably identify it, but you can get papers that if you're reading it out of the, you don't know it's retracted. I know that might be hard to believe, but Daniel, you can back me up on that.
100%, I back you up. So sometimes you use like Zotero or thing, and you have like a paper saved from like 5 years ago, and you read the PDF that is attached there. And the retraction notices are really bad, and because they actively don't want to say that they retracted it. They push against retraction so much that they so Google Scholar won't show you that things are retracted. It's really hard unless you go to the website and you read kind of a small note at the beginning, or you use some tool that let you know automatically, but it's hard.
I guess what I was suggesting, the author of the review needs to correct the review and resubmit that with this knowledge it's become available through ChatGPT, right?
Right. So say she verifies the paper has been retracted. And the question has been raised, why didn't she figured that out before? ChatGPT told her, and it's hard to figure out, but there are resources, there are databases you could look at. But say we're at the point now where she discovers this, and it has already been submitted to the journal, and it's included not only in her review, let's say as introduction or background, but it's actually included in her analysis in the review. So the recommendation here is she, write to the journal and retract her own paper, which is under review, and then remove the retracted paper from her review. So what do people think of that?
Transparency. I mean, she clearly has to be transparent about it. And, the journal will say, okay, fine, correct the paper and resubmit it. It's a review paper. So again, it's almost impossible to find out, of all the many papers you have to read for a review, how many have been retracted. It's having a tool like ChatGPT detect that. I think it saves a lot of time.
I think there are better tools is what.
Well, it's just, yeah.
And
the one pass.
And that is why a researcher could easily miss it, right? Because you're screening thousands of papers for a review. So you could easily miss it. So everyone think it should be removed from the review.
Yes.
So there's I tend to actually agree with that, but let me just say that there's a paper coming out from a group at the University of Chicago, it may have come out, actually expressing different opinions on that. And I think the question is, you have to figure out where in the paper or where in the review the paper might be cited, right? So if it is in the analysis, then it should definitely be retracted. If it's cited elsewhere, I think there's a debate about, you know, and I have a very strong view on that, but there is a debate about whether you can continue to cite retracted papers in introductions, for example, or discussions for context.
Perpetuates bad publication if you still use it, right? I mean, we don't want that, especially we've been talking about regaining trust in science, and this would definitely perpetuate that mistrust.
I think we're all in a pretty single view here on that. Any dissent on that? Because I'm going to make it more complicated in a second.
This is more like, okay, this is more like retraction. This is like, it's not about ChatGPT, right? It's just like,
Right,
what do you
right.
do? There was, let me just throw like another thing.
Yes.
So there was a paper recently, it wasn't ChatGPT exactly, but there's an AI system that can check mathematical proofs. And there's a paper, the famous mathematician who found that there was a flaw in his proof of a paper. And the flaw was found by AI. What should he do?
We have a couple up here, I think.
Credit, you credit AI.
For finding it. Okay, oh, you remember?
That helped me remember, because I think like if it was part of like the results, you would still want to retract it, but then you would need to credit the AI and add that like to your Prisma exclusionary criteria, right? That you withdrew or excluded a paper because it was retracted, right? So that's your transparency there, which I think you were getting to. I think the other side of that is, you know, I always like to try to think about things from all angles, and I'm wondering, you know, do you cite a retracted paper just depending on the context in which you're citing it? And I was trying to think of maybe an example of when it would be appropriate to use that. And so I don't think that there's like a blanket rule, like you can never cite a retracted paper, because I imagine there's some sort of exception out there that I just can't think of right now. But
If it's about criticism or flaws, yeah. Yes.
I want to add, I think, you know, it's important to remember the author is responsible for the analysis and the results, and that can't come from AI. So you can cite that you used AI to hint at a possibility, but then it's on the researcher to validate that result. It's on the researcher to validate that the paper was actually retracted, and that's not another error.
Exactly. And I think you were talking about the Prisma diagram. So also, if your protocol did not specify that you were going to exclude retracted papers, you know, because obviously this met all the other inclusion criteria, you'd have to actually go back and correct the protocol to say that, which should have been done, you know, before the fact. So gets a little complicated, but let's just imagine for a moment, we'll stick with the easy case, which is retractions. I want to get to expressions of concern and problematic studies in a bit, but we'll stick with the easy case of retractions. So the author notices that in this review, there are 3 other papers by this author. So what are you going to do about those?
With no obvious retraction or expression of
With
concern.
no retraction notice, yes.
I think they stand. I mean, I guess you could look at timeline, you know, when was the other one retracted? Were they similar types of studies? Were they in the same vein? But
So would we know why the paper was retracted to begin with?
Yeah, that's a good question. Let's say it was bad. Let's say there was something about data fabrication, and it took, you know, 15 years to investigate this, and it finally got retracted. But it's a very solid case.
So then that calls into question the other papers published by the same group, right? So even though they have not been retracted, then you can go back and use some of the resources that are available to see if indeed some of the data have been fabricated. Just, I mean, there's nothing you can do at that point other than maybe if you find something in those other papers to then contact the Office of Research Integrity at that institution. And they do those analysis. Yeah.
Yeah, I will try to do a little investigation myself. I just feel so strongly about this thing that, and try to, contact their university, the journal, try to dig myself into if I find any other problem. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, so you would try to see if it was coming from the same data set or the same grant. Yeah. So what about if it was an investigator that had, a senior investigator, and they've been a director of 3 different labs over the last 20 years? Just thinking of everything, reflecting on everything we heard about research culture today. And the papers that have been included don't necessarily come from the same data set, but they come from this same investigator who's, had some, because of the topic of the review, published on this topic over a period of, 15 years.
It seems a little risky to make character judgments, and I guess maybe as a different question, is there not a tool that a researcher can generally use and I would expect might be part of a protocol like this one to assess quality and risk of this sort of thing in studies, rather than needing to make a character judgment and having a moral stance on whether people can ever be redeemed?
I don't remember if this is a grad student or the postdoc that's writing this paper, but I would get my PI involved and have them part of the conversation if this person was very senior in the field, and then potentially loop our regulatory and compliance officer in, because this publication is going to be a direct reflection of my university, and get that conversation started.
Right, all good suggestions. So get the PI involved, get the research integrity office involved, get the regulatory compliance office involved, and potentially even some of those units at the other person's institution. But I want to go back to Matt's comment. What we're saying here is that we're taking action based on the individual, not based on the work itself. So does that raise any concerns for anybody?
I mean, the problem is that we all have a reputation to uphold, right? And if all of a sudden you find out that this individual, and I actually did some work for the Office of Research Integrity here. There was someone who was actually duplicating Western blot images across a ton of different papers. And it wasn't until there was an instance where it was discovered in one of the papers that then we went back and looked at all of the other previous papers, and there seemed to be a pattern. So, if it requires a lot of legwork, but, it can be done. I mean, there are tools to see if, if bands are replicated, if they're exactly the same, the way that they run in the gel. And, journals are trying to avoid that now by requiring that, you can actually publish just a strip of the Western blot, but you have to submit the whole thing so that we know that, the issues of the non-specific binding of the antibody are considered, because again, there have been a lot of instances of that happening. But the problem is that once you discover that, then it makes you suspicious of all of the work coming out of that individual's work.
Yeah, I'll just say, so journals are also using tools, right? Forensic tools to look at images before they're published. So some of this is being caught in the front end. And the standard, at least right now, is 6 years, right? So within the 6 years of whatever paper has been retracted, you're at least obligated to look within the 6 years of that. So I guess it depends on when those other papers were published relative to the one that was retracted. And And similarly, where do the other papers fall in the context of the thing that you're reporting, right? So if they're in line, I guess, with whatever else, you've selected them because they have fallen in line with your criteria and there don't seem to be any issues. Again, I think, you know, to Matt's point, I don't know that we can be that each individual researcher is the ethics police, right? Like we need to keep an eye on things and certainly want to, but yeah, again, making judgments based on a finding, I think is tricky. And it, you know, it kind of goes beyond at least the way that we want the process to work, which is they were held accountable for what was brought, and to further penalize them without evidence. I don't know how that any of us really wants to be in that situation.
Yeah, so I'm working with Cochrane, which is a systematic review journal, to develop a tool. My area is like randomized controlled trials, to develop a method for identifying what we call problematic randomized controlled trials. So to Matt's question, there are lots of methods out there, you know, for various types of data, and we're looking at trial data. And one of the one of the categories, so we're trying to have red flags that would trigger you to look at more papers, and either they're on the same topic, or if someone has had a retracted paper, then that would trigger the application of this tool, but it wouldn't automatically trigger that all their papers would be excluded, right? So it would have to be verified by this tool. And the tools can be very complicated because some require looking at the primary data. So the move towards open science really helps that, because it's kind of a red flag. If you ask for the data and somebody says, no, I'm not giving it to you, then you can't apply some of these checks. And I know, Daniel, you're working on automating these kind of things. But I'm just, you know, wondering again about the equity issues, because we have to be very, very careful in managing what our rules are about including studies in a review or not, because we want to do it on the basis of the actual study and not any investigator characteristics. But we can't deny that people have worked in a certain culture. Thank you.
I was thinking that there are researchers who have engaged in bad behavior that you're not policing, it's known. And you should be asking when you're doing a review, are there any other studies that are saying the same thing that I can cite in place of that person's point? And you can even go a step further and say, are there any non-white, non-male, non-US centered or non-European centered studies that are also saying the same thing? I mean, there is selection that goes into who you are citing, and you have a lot of choices over that. So it's just a choice.
Yeah, and that's actually why, you know, the pre-specified inclusion and exclusion criteria are so important, because that makes it clear you're not, your choice is based on the topic or the question or the outcome measure, not who's doing the research. So I think that's really, really important. But that is a trigger that does get people to look at a body of evidence, right? And so are there any issues then about persons who have worked with that kind of individual? Say you were a postdoc in their lab two times back, right? And, you know, a lot of questions have been raised about one of their papers. It's, you know, may not be enough to get it retracted, but you don't really trust the paper. So how do you manage these run-on effects for people who have also worked in the group?
I will say we have had a similar situation of a long-standing negative culture. Lots of, you know, successful scientists came out of that. The concerns actually came to a head, and those students actually, or former students actually, are concerned about their reputation. And I guess then we follow on, how are they judged if they're not cited, their career's not moving forward? You know, even though they may have, and this is what happened ultimately, is that students did, right, I think they are becoming more savvy. They aren't like us who were like, okay, that's the boss, I do what they say, and I just move on. They realized it and sort of cleaned things up and excluded, you know, the person in most of the critical decisions, which is easy once you have an established PI who's more hands-off, right? So they managed it on their own, and I certainly would not want them to be penalized for having been associated with this toxic.
Yeah, I wanted to say two seemingly contradicting things. So one is that, yeah, I feel like depending on how grave the misconduct is, if it's like super bad and it's like they're actively trying to deceive and it doesn't look like a mistake and they did it systematically, I feel like we should be willing to go. We should just look at all the papers. I feel like there is always a very high correlation between a pattern and all their research. However, I feel like we should also normalize retractions in a way. I feel people make mistakes and students make mistakes, and even you could say that people, you know, under pressure, especially students, sometimes they kind of, as the speaker, the first speaker, the keynote was saying, they move, they make things, they increasingly rationalize things. So I think retractions should lose some of the negative aspect to it, because that's just how science works. You make mistakes, and sometimes those mistakes you should be able to redeem yourself. And I mean, I made a mistake in my paper, and we're submitting I mean, I didn't like do it on purpose, but I guess it's something that like contradicts the paper. But that should be part of science, and that's healthy science.
I think that's such an important point, and it goes back to what CK was saying this morning about the use of words. So I really don't like using words like fraud and misconduct, because it suggests intent, and people do make mistakes that are so bad that the data are not trustworthy. They're not valid, but it can be a mistake. So I do think I totally agree that it's important to try to tease that out, especially when you go into investigating a whole lab. And again, you could say, well, if you got the right culture in your lab, there should be less mistakes, you know, and your research group should always be questioning and admitting when they make mistakes. And that is true. So if you have that kind of culture, maybe this would happen less. But right now it's pretty common, actually. So it's a good thing. Yeah.
Can you hear me? Probably. I was just going to share kind of a parallel that's happening in the field of nursing right now, if you're not aware. Where I don't know if you heard about the case at Vanderbilt, where a nurse who had a medication error was actually criminally prosecuted, and the prosecution won. I mean, if you really look at that case, the system enabled her error, yet we blamed an individual. So I think it's just a really good point that, again, going back to the culture of the lab or whatever these things are, like maybe from the journal standpoint, we need to do better. I don't know. I'm just saying, I think it's a really good point about structure and systems. So
that's great. I mean, we'll never be error free, but having this reducing the chance in the system is where we want to go. Any other points about this case or questions that it raises? I guess I just have one last question to throw out to the panel, because I thought this morning, you know, this idea of having, you know, pre-planned questions and statements and thinking through what you're going to say when somebody accosts you on campus and asks you to join the committee. I need that one. But anyway, it was so say you are working, you know, with a group where you suspect there are serious data integrity problems in another group that you've discovered somehow through your work because you're just scrutinizing every paper that this other group has done. And we talked a little bit about resources we could go to, but how would you even start approaching someone about that?
I guess it depends on what your relationship with the other group is, right? I mean, if they're close collaborators, I certainly would raise it. If they're not close collaborators and you scrutinize the work from that particular group and you find a lot of mistakes, I definitely would go to the Office of Research Integrity.
What would you go armed with?
With the data that I discovered that, you know, they have duplicated Western blots and label them differently. I mean, again, there are tools that you can use and, you know, there are some repeat offenders out there. So, you know, if you have a close relationship, then definitely I would bring it up to whoever's in charge of that other team. Otherwise, I would.
I mean, I would agree, right? It's all of our jobs to sort of maintain the integrity of science. And if you are an expert in that same field and you can have the capability of assessing it, and you have concerns, I think it's totally legit. I mean, I think bringing it up with the group is, even if they're close collaborators, is easier said than done. You know, it can really make some, for some uncomfortable conversations, not that we shouldn't have those. But yeah, I mean, even raising it with whatever institution that those folks are at, I think is worthwhile if that's what you're comfortable with, because it is on all of us to maintain that integrity.
And there's so much pressure to publish and get grants, and that's the only way you will get promoted or tenure, et cetera. That again, I mean, it's just, I think it's escalated over the last few years, especially because a lot of the academic positions are so few and far between. So, you know, that raises the ethical question of, are we training too many researchers? I mean, so we have a glut in the system, but not enough positions for them. I mean, that's another question for another discussion, but again, I mean, because of the critical mass, I mean, what is it? Only 30% get positions in academia?
Yeah, well, pressure in the system is part of the system, right?
Yeah.
So that's, you know, that is part of the system. Yes.
God, that presupposes that folks want to stay in academia though, right? So I teach ethics for computational biosciences. And I always ask my crew, like, you know, who actually wants to do this job? And this year, 2 out of 9 raised their hand. The other 7, either graduate students and postdocs, all have their eyes on careers outside academia. And we, you know, we looked at this, 15 years ago with the leaky pipeline, was it? The NSF publication about all of this. So I don't know if the needle's moved much in that time, but anyway, just a thought.
And I think there are mandates now for more training for folks and more opportunities for career development in other spaces besides academia.
Yeah, no, I mean, that obviously, I mean, we're talking about the publication and the grant writing. Usually that happens in the context of academia. But yes, I mean, there are other careers that you can go into with a research degree.
Daniel, did you have something on this point of the?
Yeah, I feel like it's on all of us. I think we should analyze criticism. I think even with, I mean, just with reproducibility stuff. I don't know if those studies, I mean, even though nobody replicated this very famous psychology study, I don't know if
You can reproduce a bad study.
Yeah, but like those people, you know, those effects and things are still in the popular culture. So we should normalize criticizing. We should normalize reporting and asking these uncomfortable questions. But it's part of the system, yeah. Unfortunately, so it's a long term.
But that's a good point. I mean, once the data are out, it's hard to get them back. And I think as we heard, you know, from our opening speaker today, what we really care is, are the data real, right? So this is all about wanting to create the real data, but also to make sure that that's what's, you know, out there in the literature, so that people can use it. Anyway, I want to thank the panel for a very rich discussion and the audience. That was fantastic. And I'll turn it over to Matt.
Yeah, I don't have much to add, just a couple of closing comments. Thanks to everyone for attending in person. Thanks to those who attended online. Be on the lookout for an email that has an evaluation in it. And just to let you know, in particular on that evaluation, we definitely pay attention to suggestions for future research ethics conference topics. So if you do have those suggestions, please do fill the evaluation out, and we'll take a look. I certainly learned a lot today from the keynote all the way through this panel. Appreciate everyone attending. Why don't you just join me in thanking our panelists again, and I hope you have a good evening.